The boy was still breathing when they found him. That was the worst part. He was maybe 9 years old, curled against the base of a rubber tree at the edge of the village, his small fingers dug into the mud like he had tried to pull himself forward and simply stopped. The jungle hummed around him. Insects, distant water, the thick wet heat that pressed against your skin like a hand. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, wrong sounds for what was lying in that dirt. Padre Augusto knelt beside him and immediately pulled back. The child's forearm was shredded, not torn by a fall, not cut by a blade, bitten, repeatedly, savagely. The wounds were already darkening at the edges, the surrounding skin laced with thin black lines that crawled up toward the elbow, like cracks in dry earth. The boy's eyes were open. They were bleeding. Not weeping, bleeding. Twin threads of dark red tracing down his temples into the mud beneath his head, as though something inside his skull had simply given up trying to hold itself together. Padre Augusto pressed 2 fingers to the child's throat, a pulse, faint, stuttering. He opened his mouth to call for help. The boy grabbed his wrist. His grip was extraordinary, inhuman for his size. His cracked lips parted, and he made a sound that wasn't a word, wasn't a cry. It was something between a hiss and a scream, something that sent every bird within 100 meters exploding out of the canopy at once. Then the grip loosened. The pulse stopped. Somewhere above them, hidden in the dense green ceiling of leaves and shadow, something moved. Then something else. Then many things, shifting, watching, completely silent. Padre Augusto did not look up. He already knew something was there. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. It was a temporary facility. 4 prefabricated walls bolted together inside a decommissioned agricultural warehouse on the outskirts of Manaus, Brazil's largest Amazonian city. Outside, the city roared and sweated in the midday heat. Inside, 6 people sat around a folding table covered in satellite maps, autopsy photographs, and a single red folder stamped with 3 words in both Portuguese and English: restricted, biological hazard, restricted. Nobody had touched the folder yet. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, studying the faces of the people she was about to lead into the most dangerous jungle on Earth. She had done this before, not this exactly, but versions of it. Ebola response in the DRC. Napa containment in Bangladesh. A hemorrhagic fever cluster in rural Myanmar that never made the news because the government paid very hard to make sure it didn't. She knew how to read a room full of scientists and soldiers pretending not to be afraid. They were all afraid. She didn't blame them. "Let's start with what we know," she said. Her English carried the faint architecture of a Spanish childhood. Bogotá, originally, though she hadn't been back in 11 years. She picked up a remote and clicked. The wall screen behind her lit up with a map of northwestern South America. 4 countries, dozens of red dots clustered along river systems that fed into the Amazon basin like tributaries of a slow catastrophe. As of this morning, confirmed deaths stand at 412 across Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. She paused, letting the number settle. Suspected deaths, meaning cases where the body was never recovered or the cause was officially recorded as something else. Bring that number closer to 700. Silence. Dr. Jin Park leaned forward in his chair. He was 31, Korean-American, with wire-rimmed glasses and the posture of someone who had spent too many years hunched over a microscope. He was already turning a pen between his fingers, a nervous habit Elena had read about in his psych profile. "What's the case fatality rate?" he asked. 100%. Elena said. The pen stopped turning. Every confirmed case has resulted in death within 48 to 72 hours of symptom onset, she continued. No survivors, no partial recoveries, no anomalies. She clicked again. A slide appeared. Clinical photographs of victims at various stages of progression. Several people at the table looked away. Marcus Cole did not. Symptoms begin with high fever and severe joint pain, consistent with a dozen other tropical infections. That's the deceptive window, roughly 12 hours where a victim feels ill, but not critically so. After that, progression is rapid. Vascular degradation, neurological disruption, hemorrhaging from the eyes, ears, and nasal passages. In the final hours, extreme agitation and aggression, followed by cardiovascular collapse. Aggression, Raya Okafor repeated. She was the wildlife biologist, Ghanaian-British, tall with close-cropped hair, and a directness in her gaze that Elena had immediately respected during their brief introduction 20 minutes ago. She said the word like she was filing it somewhere important. That's unusual for a hemorrhagic presentation. It is, Elena agreed. It's one of the things that makes VZ1 unlike anything currently in the literature. VZ1, Marcus Cole said from the far end of the table. His voice was flat and deliberate, a voice built for giving orders in loud places. He was 43, broad across the shoulders, with a greying, close-cut beard and the particular stillness of someone trained to conserve energy at all times. Ex-82nd Airborne, then 12 years with USAMRIID's Field Security Division. He had escorted science teams into 3 active conflict zones and 1 Level 4 outbreak. He had never lost a team member. He appeared to treat this fact not as luck, but as a personal policy. That's what we're calling it? That's what the WHO classification office assigned, Elena said. Virus 0, strain 1. The name reflects how little we know. It's not a variant of anything previously catalogued. It's new. How new? Jin asked. First confirmed case was 14 weeks ago. A rubber tapper named Emilio Barros, found dead in his home in a village called São Benedito do Rio Preto, 60 kilometers south of the Venezuelan border. Elena clicked again. A photograph of a small house. Then a photograph of a man who had been alive 3 days before the picture was taken, and then very clearly wasn't. His wife reported that he'd come home from work 2 days earlier complaining of a bite on his ankle. She described it as looking like an animal bite. Multiple puncture marks, irregular spacing. What animal? Raya asked immediately. She didn't see what made it, neither did he. Eleanor held Raya's gaze for a moment. That question is a significant part of why you're here. Dr. Felix Hartmann cleared his throat softly. He was seated to Elena's right. Late 40s, German, silver-haired in a way that looked almost deliberate, like he'd decided to grow into it gracefully, and succeeded. He was a virologist of considerable reputation, published in every journal that mattered, and he carried this reputation the way certain men carry expensive watches, not ostentatiously, but with the quiet assurance that you would eventually notice. Elena had worked with him once before, 4 years ago in Geneva. She had respected his mind completely and trusted his motives only partially. The transmission vector, he said, folding his hands on the table. That's the central unknown. We have a virus with 100% lethality, rapid progression, and no identified source. Before we discuss field strategy, I think we need to discuss how much of this data has been independently verified. All of it, Elena said. By whom? By the Brazilian Ministry of Health, the PAHO regional office, and a CDC advanced team that was pulled out 6 days ago after 2 of its members became symptomatic. The The room shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of shift that happens when people recalibrate their understanding of how dangerous a situation actually is. Became symptomatic, Jin said carefully. Meaning they're dead, Marcus said. He wasn't asking. Elena nodded once. Dr. Patricia Lowe and field technician Brendan Cho, both deceased within 60 hours of first symptoms. Cause of death confirmed as VZ1. The remaining CDC team members were placed in isolation, cleared after 14 days, and are currently in Washington. She paused. That is why this mission was reassembled from scratch with a new team. That is also why your hazmat protocols are non-negotiable from the moment we cross the tree line. Tomas Guerrero had said nothing since sitting down. He sat slightly apart from the others, a deliberate distance that was less antisocial than geographic. He simply occupied space differently than the scientists did, like a man who was accustomed to being in rooms where he was the only one who knew how to get out of them. He was 46, Brazilian, from a river community 2 days downstream from Manaus. He had been guiding research expeditions into the Amazon for 19 years. Biologists, geologists, documentary crews, pharmaceutical scouts. His face was weathered and patient and gave very little away. Elena had been told by 3 separate people who had worked with him that he was the best jungle guide alive, and that he sometimes knew things he couldn't explain how he knew. She believed both. The villages, Tomas said. His English was precise and slow, chosen carefully. The ones on the map. You should know. The people in those communities are not numbers in a report. He looked at the red dots on the screen without blinking. San Benedito, Rio Oscuro, Santa Cruz del Rio. I have been to all of them. I know families there. He looked at Elena. How many are left? Elena held his gaze. San Benedito has been evacuated. Rio Oscuro, we don't have current information. Santa Cruz del Rio. She paused in the way doctors learn to pause. Santa Cruz del Rio went silent 11 days ago. A military flyover 3 days later reported no visible activity. Tomas absorbed this with a stillness that was clearly costing him something. He nodded once and looked back at the map. Jin was already writing. He wrote constantly, not on a tablet, but in a physical notebook with a dark green cover, the pages thick with tiny, precise handwriting that looked less like notes and more like calculations. 11 days silent, and we're only being sent in now, he said, without looking up. What exactly has the government been doing for? Managing the press, Marcus said. Jin looked up. Excuse me? That's not cynicism, Doctor. That's logistics. Marcus gestured at the map. 4 countries, porous borders, jungle terrain. You contain the information before you can contain the outbreak. Otherwise you have mass movement, refugee corridors, urban spread. You've seen what panic does to a hot zone. He said it without judgment, the tone of someone describing weather patterns. The governments involved have been coordinating a media blackout while the WHO puts together a response. That's us. We're the response. We're 6 people, Jin said. We're the advance team, Elena corrected. Our job is not to stop the outbreak. Our job is to identify the transmission vector, characterize the pathogen in its natural environment, and establish whether containment at source is viable. If we can answer those questions, the larger response has something to work with. She looked around the table. If we can't answer them, the models suggest we are looking at a regional epidemic within 60 days and a global health emergency within 90. No one spoke for a moment. Outside, a truck rattled past on the road. Somewhere in the warehouse rafters, something small moved in the darkness above the fluorescent lights. Raya opened the red folder. The first page was a field report from a wildlife survey conducted 8 months earlier. Standard biodiversity monitoring along a tributary called the Rio Sombra, a secondary river cutting deep into a stretch of protected forest that bordered all 4 of the affected countries. The survey team had noted several anomalies in primate population behavior before their funding was cut and the project abandoned. Raya read the summary paragraph twice, then looked up slowly. "Has anyone followed up on this survey?" she asked, turning the page to face Eleanor. Eleanor's expression answered before her words did. "That's also why you're here." They flew out of Manaus at 5 the following morning in a Brazilian Air Force helicopter that smelled of fuel and old canvas. The city dissolved beneath them quickly, the sprawl of rooftops giving way to the outer neighborhoods. Then the river, wide and dark as hammered copper in the pre-dawn light. And then the jungle. It was always the jungle that did it to people the first time. Even those who had been briefed, photographed, mapped, and satellite imaged. Even scientists who understood intellectually what 4 million square kilometers of continuous rainforest meant. There was always a moment when the helicopter carried them out over the canopy, and the human world simply ended. No roads, no structures, no light, just an unbroken, undulating green that stretched in every direction to the edges of vision and beyond, breathing slowly with the morning mist that rose from it like exhalation. Jin pressed his face briefly to the window and said nothing. Marcus had seen jungles before, but not this one. He noted the sightlines. None. The terrain, unreadable. The access points, entirely dependent on the waterways cutting silver threads through the green below. He began running scenarios with the calm efficiency of a man who processed danger the way other people processed weather forecasts. Unpleasant, possibly severe, manageable with preparation. Raya watched the canopy like she was reading it. Her eyes moved differently than the others, not scanning for landmarks or calculating distances, but observing. The way the trees clustered, the gaps where water ran beneath, the occasional clearings, too circular to be natural. She had spent 11 years studying primate behavior across 4 continents, and she recognized the Amazon the way you recognize a difficult person you've encountered before, with respect, without illusion. Tomas slept, or appeared to. His arms were folded, his chin dropped, but Elena noticed that every time the helicopter banked or changed altitude, his eyes opened for exactly 2 seconds, confirmed something outside the window, and closed again. Felix sat beside Elena, reviewing pathology slides on a tablet, his reading glasses low on his nose. He scrolled without expression through images that would have made most people leave the room. "The neurological component is what I keep returning to," he said quietly, not looking up. "The aggression in the final stage. There are only a handful of pathogens that produce behavioral modification this pronounced. Rabies, obviously. The Ophiocordyceps fungi in insects." He paused. "There's a theoretical class of RNA viruses that could interact with the limbic system if—" "Let's collect samples before we write the paper," Elena said. Felix smiled without warmth. "Of course." They made first landfall at a river outpost, a collection of floating platforms and corrugated rooftops that served as a supply depot for the surrounding communities. The helicopter couldn't go further without refueling. From here, they would travel by motorized canoe up the Rio Sombra, toward the last recorded coordinates of the Wildlife Survey team and the outer edge of the affected zone. The outpost was staffed by a Brazilian army unit, 12 soldiers who had been stationed there for 3 weeks and had the eyes of people who had been told to hold a position without being told why. Their commanding officer, a young lieutenant named Ferreira, gave Marcus a satellite phone, 3 days of emergency rations per person, and a piece of information he delivered in the tone of someone who had rehearsed, not sounding frightened. "Last night," Lieutenant Ferreira said, in Portuguese that Tomás translated in real time, "one of my men heard sounds from the eastern tree line. He described it as," Ferreira checked his notes, "like something practicing to be quiet and almost succeeding." Marcus looked at the tree line. "What did he see?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," Ferreira said. "How many of your men have seen nothing at the tree line in the last 3 weeks?" Marcus asked. Ferreira looked at him for a moment. 7, he said. Marcus nodded slowly, picked up his pack, and walked toward the canoes. Elena watched him go, then looked at the eastern tree line herself. Dense, dark beyond the first layer of vegetation, where the light gave up. Still now, completely still, with that particular jungle stillness that was never actually silence, but felt like it, because everything making sound was invisible. She turned back to her team. "Gear check," she said. "We leave in 20 minutes." The Rio Sombra earned its name, Shadow River. The locals had called it that long before any cartographer arrived to make it official, and traveling up it by canoe made the reason immediately clear. The river was narrow enough in places that the canopy closed overhead completely, the trees on both banks leaning toward each other like the arched ribs of something enormous that had swallowed them whole. The light that filtered through was green and fractured and dim, arriving in thin columns that moved across the water's surface as the vegetation shifted above. Even at 9 in the morning, it felt like dusk. They traveled in 2 canoes, Elena, Jin, and Raya in the first, Marcus, Felix, and Tomás in the second. The outboard motors were small and loud, their mechanical stuttering the only sound that didn't belong to the jungle. Everything else belonged entirely to it. The clicks and screams of insects, the irregular percussion of water dripping from overhanging leaves, bird calls that arrived without warning and stopped the same way, and beneath all of it, constant and barely perceptible, the low respiratory sound of the forest itself, the movement of air through millions of leaves, the settling of wood, the soft collapse of rot returning to soil. Jin had his notebook open across his knees, already writing. He was cataloguing everything. Water temperature readings from a pocket sensor, GPS waypoints every 10 minutes, visual notes on vegetation density and river width. He had built a spreadsheet before departure that he called a baseline environmental matrix, and he was filling it with the focused energy of someone who found data genuinely comforting. Raya sat at the bow of the first canoe and watched the banks. Elena watched Raya. The wildlife biologist had gone quiet the moment they entered the river, her earlier directness compressed into something more concentrated. Her eyes moved continuously, not anxiously, but with the patient sweep of a professional scanner. After 40 minutes on the water, she raised one hand and Elena cut the motor. Silence rushed in. "There," Raya said softly. On the left bank, perhaps 8 meters from the water's edge, a cluster of cecropia trees stood at the border between the river and the deeper forest. Cecropias were fast-growing pioneers. They colonized gaps and edges, and they were almost always occupied. Spider monkeys, capuchins, tamarins. The canopy above them should have been restless with movement. It was empty, not just unoccupied, empty in the way that spaces become empty after something has recently been in them and left. The branches were still. No feeding debris on the ground below. No sounds. "How long since something was in those trees?" Elena asked. "Not long," Raya said. "See the broken terminal shoots on the second trunk? Fresh. The sap is still wet." She paused. Something was feeding there within the last 2 hours, and then stopped. And moved. Her eyes tracked along the bank, following something Elena couldn't read. "Moved that way." She pointed upriver, the direction they were heading. In the second canoe, Tomas had cut his motor without being told to. He was already looking at the same bank. When Eleanor glanced back at him, he met her eyes briefly and gave a small nod that communicated something she didn't entirely understand, but filed carefully. They continued upriver. The first village took 40 minutes to reach. It wasn't on Elena's primary map, just a small riverside settlement, 8 or 9 structures built on raised platforms above the flood line, connected by wooden walkways. A subsistence community, probably 20 to 30 people in better times, a place that existed because the river existed, and for no other reason. It had a name painted on a board nailed to a tree at the water's edge, Boca do Sombra. It was not on the list of affected communities. It was not on any official alert. It was also completely silent. Marcus had his hand on his sidearm before the canoe touched the bank. Not drawn, just present, the way a careful man keeps options available. He stepped out first, scanned the walkways, the doorways, the gaps between buildings. Nothing moved. "Hello?" Tomas called out in Portuguese. Then, in the regional dialect he carried from his childhood on the river. His voice went out into the settlement and came back changed, flattened by the wrongness of the silence around it. They spread out carefully. Pairs, the protocol Elena had drilled into them during the single day of field preparation they'd been given. Hazmat suits for any interior examination. Distance maintained. No unnecessary contact with surfaces. The settlement wasn't abandoned. That was the first thing Elena registered, and it sent ice through her chest despite the heat. Abandoned meant gone. This was something else. There were signs of interrupted life everywhere. A cooking fire that had burned down to cold ash, but still had a pot resting above it. The contents long since evaporated to a dark residue. Clothing hung on a line, sun-bleached and stiff. A child's sandal in the middle of a walkway, one strap broken, as though it had been stepped out of mid-stride. Jin found the first body in the third structure. An elderly man, seated against the far wall with his back straight and his hands in his lap, as though he had sat down to wait for something, and the waiting had taken everything he had. The vascular blackening across his face and neck was extensive, dark branching lines that mapped his circulatory system like ink pressed into the skin. His eyes were closed, which was the only mercy in the image. "Don't touch anything," Elena said into her suit radio, her voice steady, because steadiness was required. "Document and move. We're not doing field autopsies here." "Elena," Raya's voice from outside. Something in it. Elena came back out onto the walkway. Raya was standing at the edge of the platform, looking down at the bank below, the narrow strip of mud between the raised structure and the water. She was pointing at the ground. Tracks, multiple sets, pressed into the soft mud in overlapping layers. Some were human footprints, bare feet, adult and child sizes, the deep heel impressions of people running. Others were not human. Elena crouched and looked more carefully. They were hand and foot impressions, small, four-fingered, with the distinctive spread of a primate's weight distribution. But larger than she expected, larger than the capuchins or spider monkeys common to this region. And numerous, dozens of individual prints overlapping in the mud beneath the platform and leading away from the settlement along the bank, upriver. "Primates," Raya said quietly. "Multiple individuals. They were under the platforms." "Under?" Jin appeared behind them, already writing. "Under the raised floors, in the gap between the structure and the ground." Raya's voice was controlled, but her jaw was tight, which means they were inside the settlement. Not passing through. Stationary. Waiting. Elena stared at the tracks for a long moment. How long ago? The deepest prints have started to fill with water seepage. Raya checked the rate by pressing a finger gently beside one impression. 3 to 6 hours. They left before dawn, or left when they heard the boats, Marcus said. He was standing at the edge of the platform with his back to them, watching the tree line on the opposite bank with an expression that gave nothing away but communicated everything. They set up base camp 2 kilometers upriver from Boca do Sombra on a wide, flat section of bank where the trees pulled back enough to allow helicopter access if required. It took 3 hours to establish. Tents, a field laboratory unit the size of a large suitcase, solar power cells, a satellite uplink. Physical work in 40-degree heat that soaked through clothing in minutes and turned every movement into an argument with gravity. While Marcus and Thomas built the perimeter, a simple rope line with motion sensor alarms at 6-meter intervals, Elena and Felix processed the environmental samples they'd collected from Boca do Sombra, and Jin built his data architecture, and Raya walked the surrounding tree line in slow, methodical passes, reading the forest. She came back to camp at dusk with mud to her knees, and 3 things to report. "There's a troop," she said, sitting down heavily on a supply case. "Large. Based on range markings and the distribution of feeding traces I've found, I'd estimate 30 to 50 individuals. They've been moving through this area repeatedly. This isn't migration, it's a pattern. They're returning to the same locations." "Species?" Felix asked. Raya hesitated, and Eleanor noticed the hesitation. The morphological evidence is inconsistent. The track size is larger than any capuchin subspecies I know, but the gait pattern and behavioral signatures don't match the larger species that should be in this region. Ateles, Lagothrix. Whatever this troop is, I don't have a clean match in my reference database. She paused. "I want to see one." "Let's hope that's a controlled experience," Marcus said. "There's more." Raya reached into her sample bag and produced an evidence pouch containing a length of branch, perhaps 30 centimeters, broken cleanly at one end. Along its surface was a dark residue, dried, reddish-brown, with a thick consistency different from tree sap. "Found this wedged at head height in a fork about 400 meters northeast. The residue is biological. I won't know more until the field kit processes it, but..." She met Elena's eyes. "It's consistent with hemorrhagic fluid." The camp went quiet, except for the jungle, which was never quiet. "They're bleeding," Jin said, the pen still for once. "Or something they bit is bleeding," Raya said carefully. Felix leaned forward. "Or they're using it," he said. The word landed strangely. Everyone looked at him. He seemed to realize it and adjusted. "Marking behavior. Some primate species use scent compounds from various biological sources to mark territory. It would be unusual with hemorrhagic material, but in an unknown species, with abnormal behavioral patterns, it would mean they know where they've been," Raya said slowly. "And they know where they're going." That night, Jin presented his preliminary epidemiological model on a laptop propped against a supply case, the screen the only real light in camp after they dimmed the lanterns to avoid attracting insects. His voice had the particular energy of someone who had been frightened and responded to fear by building structures around it. "So, the distribution pattern of confirmed cases," he said, pulling up his map overlay, "doesn't follow standard vector logic. For a pathogen transmitted by contact or bodily fluid, you'd expect clustering around family units, shared water sources, communal gathering points. Instead, he traced the pattern of red dots. It follows the river systems, not the villages on the rivers themselves." "Meaning the vector is mobile," Elena said. "Highly mobile. moving upstream to downstream along multiple tributaries in a pattern consistent with—" He paused, and Elena could see him deciding how certain to sound. "A traveling animal population." "The troop," Raya said. "Possibly. Probably." Jin took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. "But here's where it gets complicated. The incubation to death window for VZ1 is 48 to 72 hours. If a human is infected by a single bite event, they die within 3 days. The virus doesn't have time to propagate through secondary human transmission before the host is gone. Which means the animal reservoir is the primary transmission mechanism," Felix said, picking up the thread with professional smoothness. "Every human death is a direct animal-to-human event. There's no meaningful human-to-human chain. Which is the only reason this isn't already a global pandemic," Elena said quietly. "It also means," Jin continued, "that the animals carrying this virus are not dying from it." Silence. "They're asymptomatic carriers," Raya said. Her voice had changed, not frightened exactly, but recalibrated. "The virus is endemic in the population. They've co-evolved with it." "For how long?" Elena asked. "Long enough that it's become part of their biology," Felix said, which raises the question of what selective pressure drove that adaptation. He looked at his hands for a moment. "And whether the aggression we see in human victims is a reflection of something also present, in modified form, in the animals." Nobody answered that. Outside the camp perimeter, the jungle made its nighttime sounds, calls and movements, and the steady percussion of rain beginning in the upper canopy, filtering down through layered vegetation until it arrived at ground level as a soft, irregular dripping. The motion sensors on the perimeter rope had triggered twice during the evening. Both times, investigation revealed nothing. The jungle at night was full of nothing that left no trace. Marcus sat at the perimeter edge, with his back to the camp and his eyes on the darkness beyond the rope. He didn't sleep during first watch, didn't intend to. In his experience, the things that got people were the things they'd already decided weren't coming. 3 days into their survey, they found the pharmaceutical outpost. It wasn't on any map they'd been given. Tomas found it, or rather, found evidence of it, while scouting a side tributary that branched from the Rio Sombra, approximately 6 kilometers north of their base camp. He came back in the early afternoon, with mud on his boots, and something careful in his expression. "There is a structure," he said. "A research facility. Not local construction. Prefabricated panels, satellite equipment, a generator housing. It has been there for some time." He paused. "It has also been empty for some time." Marcus went with him to look while the others continued sample processing. They were back within 2 hours, and Marcus's expression when he returned carried the particular quality of someone who has added new information to a threat assessment and doesn't like the result. "Gene Vance," he said, setting a piece of debris on the field lab table, a fragment of laminated plastic, partially melted, with a corporate logo still legible on its surface. The name beneath the logo, Genevant's Biosolutions, Field Research Unit 7. Elena stared at it. Gene Vance was a mid-sized Swiss pharmaceutical company with significant Amazon research interests, primarily botanical compounds, antimicrobial agents derived from jungle organisms. She knew the name professionally, the way you know names at the edges of your field. She did not know they had a field station on the Rio Sombra. Nobody had told her. "How long has it been empty?" Jin asked. "Tomas thinks 6 to 8 months, Marcus said, based on vegetation regrowth through the access paths and the state of the equipment." He paused. The laboratory unit was stripped, not abandoned, stripped. Someone removed all the research materials, all the hard drives, all the sample storage. But they left the structural equipment. They left in a hurry, and they left selectively. Someone knew what was valuable, Felix said. His voice was neutral in the way that neutral voices sometimes aren't. Elena looked at him. "You knew about this station," she said. Not a question. Felix met her gaze without flinching, which she noted. "I knew Jean Vance had research interests in this region," he said. "I was not informed of a specific facility. That is the truth." "But you knew the company." "Everyone in pharmaceutical virology knows Jean Vance." A slight pause. "Elena, if I had information that was relevant to this team's safety, I would share it." Elena held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to communicate that she was filing this, then looked back at the debris. "We need to find out what they were researching here," she said. "And we need to find out why they left, without telling anyone." The close encounter happened on the morning of day 4. Raya had established an observation point 50 meters from camp, a small elevated platform built between 2 trees, accessible by a crude rope ladder, positioned to overlook a section of forest where she had identified high concentrations of primate activity from track evidence and acoustic monitoring. She had been spending her pre-dawn hours there, alone, which Marcus had argued against, and she had overruled with the quiet authority of someone who considered the scientific requirement non-negotiable. She saw them at 5:47 a.m., when the light was still grey and thin, and the mist lay in long horizontal bands between the trunks at ground level. There were 11 of them in the first group she counted, moving through the mid-canopy at a height of approximately 12 to 15 meters. Not the high canopy travel of spider monkeys, not the ground-level movement of terrestrial species, but a middle zone that gave them simultaneous visibility of the forest floor and the upper branches. They moved with a smoothness that was technically extraordinary, each individual placing hands and feet with precision, minimal branch disturbance, almost no sound. They were larger than she'd expected, even from the tracks. The largest individual she could see had a body mass she estimated at 15 to 18 kilograms, significantly above any capuchin and approaching the range of a large spider monkey. But the morphology was wrong for either. The face was broader. The coloring was unusual, predominantly dark, almost charcoal grey, with a reddish-brown patch across the crown that she had never seen in any species photograph or description in her 11 years of primate research. She was recording everything on a small video camera, her breathing controlled and deliberate. They hadn't seen her. Or they had seen her and decided she wasn't worth reacting to, which her professional mind filed as more concerning. Then the lead individual stopped. It was clearly the lead, positioned at the front of the group's movement, larger than the others, with a bearing that communicated authority in the way such things translate across species. It stopped on a branch perhaps 20 meters from her platform and turned its head. Not toward a sound or a movement. Directly toward her. The others stopped too, simultaneously, without signal that she could detect. The lead individual looked at her for what her internal clock measured as approximately 12 seconds. The eyes were dark and set wide in the broad face, with an intelligence in them that she had encountered before in great apes and a handful of highly cognitively complex primates, but never in anything that should have been present in this region. Not curiosity. Something cooler than curiosity. Assessment. Then it made a sound, low, complex, structured in a way that moved through 3 distinct registers within a single vocalization. Not an alarm call. She knew alarm calls in every primate family. Not a contact call. Something that had the quality of a directive. The group moved on, gone within 30 seconds, dissolving into the canopy as completely as if they'd never been there. Raya sat on her platform for a long time after, her camera still running, pointed at empty branches. When she came back to camp, she set her camera on the field table without a word and pressed play. The team gathered around the small screen and watched the footage twice in silence. When it finished, nobody spoke immediately. "That's not in any catalogue," Jin said finally. His voice was careful. "That animal is not in any catalogue." "No," Raya agreed. "The behavior," Felix said, leaning closer to the screen. "The simultaneous cessation of movement. The response to the vocalization. That's not standard. It's coordinated," Raya said. "And it's deliberate." She looked up from the screen. "That lead animal told the group to stop, and then told them to move, and they did, immediately, without hesitation." She paused. "I've studied primates for 11 years, and I have never seen intergroup responsiveness at that level outside of great apes." "What does it mean?" Jin asked. Raya looked at him for a moment. "It means that whatever these animals are, they are organized. They communicate efficiently. They move with purpose." She glanced toward the tree line and then back. "And the one at the front knew exactly where I was and exactly how long to look at me before deciding I wasn't worth engaging." "Wasn't worth engaging yet," Marcus said from the back of the group. No one corrected him. The argument came that evening, and it had been building since Geneva for Elena and Felix, and since the briefing room for everyone else. Jin had cross-referenced his epidemiological data with Raya's behavioral observations and produced what he called a transmission probability model, which showed in clean visual terms that every confirmed VZ1 death within the affected zone fell within a 12-kilometer radius of the Rio Sombra's primary tributary system, the same system the unknown primate troop was using as its travel corridor. "The correlation is 94.3%, Jin said. "At that level, we're not talking about coincidence. We're talking about direct causation. These animals are the vector. We don't have a confirmed bite-to-infection event," Felix said. "We have tracks near affected settlements, behavioral observations, and a statistical correlation. That is not sufficient to establish causation for a pathogen of this severity." "What more do you need?" Raya asked. "We have a new primate species with no documented predators, no fear response to humans, and an active presence at the sites of every major infection cluster. The first recorded victim had a bite wound. We found hemorrhagic material on their territorial markings." "Correlation," Felix repeated, with the patience of someone who had made this argument in front of peer review committees. "Even high correlation. We need a specimen." "You want to catch one?" Marcus said flatly. "I want to collect a biological sample, a tissue sample, blood, saliva, something from which we can isolate and confirm the pathogen in the animal's system. Without that confirmation, we still have enough to begin a containment recommendation," Elena said. "We can advise the WHO on a probable vector based on current evidence, and let the next team come in with proper capture protocols." "And if we're wrong," Felix said, "if we recommend containment of a primate population based on incomplete data, and it turns out the actual vector is environmental, a soil reservoir, water contamination, insect-borne, then we've sent people into the jungle to remove animals that aren't the problem, while the actual source continues killing." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone makes an argument everyone wishes they couldn't follow. Elena looked at the map, at the dots, at the river. "We have 4 more days before our extraction window," she said. "We use them, we get closer, we get a sample if we can do it safely." She looked at Marcus. "And we do it with full protocol and your sign-off on every approach." Marcus looked at the tree line, the familiar tree line, with its familiar darkness and its familiar stillness that wasn't stillness at all. 4 days, he said. Then we're gone whether we have the sample or not. Agreed, Elena said. Outside, something moved along the perimeter rope. The motion sensor triggered and went quiet. When Marcus checked, the rope was undamaged. The ground beneath it showed no tracks, but the sensor had been turned around, rotated 180 degrees on its mount, so that instead of facing outward toward the jungle, it was now facing inward toward the camp. Marcus stared at it for a long time in the beam of his flashlight. Then he went back inside and said nothing to anyone until morning. The sensor had been a message. Marcus didn't say that out loud, because saying it out loud required accepting what it implied, that the animals outside their perimeter had observed the sensor's function, understood its purpose, and deliberately inverted it as a demonstration. That was not a thing animals did. That was not a thing these animals should be capable of doing. He had replaced the sensor, reinforced the perimeter line with 2 additional units, and spent the remainder of the night sitting with his back to the camp and his flashlight off, watching the darkness with the particular quality of attention he had developed in places where the darkness sometimes shot back. Nothing came. By morning, he had decided it was mechanical. Vibration, an animal brushing against the mount without intent, random rotation. He had decided this the way you decide things that allow you to function. He didn't believe it. Day 5 began with rain, not the filtering drip of canopy precipitation, but a direct equatorial downpour that arrived without warning at 6 a.m. and reduced visibility to approximately 4 meters in every direction. The jungle sounds changed immediately. The complexity of the normal acoustic environment compressed into a single white roar of water on leaves, water on water, water on the tarpaulin above the field laboratory. Elena used the confinement productively. The field kit had completed overnight processing on Raya's hemorrhagic residue sample, and the results were on her screen when she sat down with her first coffee. VZ1RNA confirmed. Concentration levels consistent with active viral shedding from a living host. She read it 3 times. Then she called the team together under the laboratory tarpaulin, rain hammering above them, and showed them the screen without preamble. The residue on the branch was deposited by an actively infected animal, she said. High viral load. The animal was shedding at the time of deposition. She paused. This confirms that members of the troop are carrying live VZ1 in their system and are distributing it through contact with surfaces. Anyone who touches contaminated surfaces without protection and then touches a mucous membrane, eyes, mouth, a cut, is at risk. Not just bites, Jin said. Bites are probably the primary transmission event, direct saliva to bloodstream. But environmental contamination is a secondary pathway we have to treat as active. Elena looked at each of them in turn. From this point forward, nobody touches anything in the field without gloves. Nobody. If your suit tears, you tell me immediately. If you're scratched by vegetation, you tell me. If you feel anything, any headache, any joint pain, any fever, you tell me before you tell yourself it's nothing. Raya was looking at the results with an expression Eleanor was learning to read, that compression of focus that preceded her most important observations. The concentration levels, Raya said. Can you cross-reference with the volume of the sample? I want to understand whether one animal produced all of this residue or whether multiple animals contributed. Elena ran the calculation. Multiple individuals, she said. Based on volume and concentration, I'd estimate 4 to 6 animals deposited this material at the same site. So they were gathering at a fixed point, Raya said. A meeting location. She looked up. Felix said last night they might be marking territory. But territorial marking is typically done by dominant individuals, 1 or 2 per troop. 4 to 6 animals marking the same site suggests something else. A coordinated behavior, Felix said quietly. He had been standing slightly apart from the group, his tablet face down on the table, which Eleanor noticed because Felix was never without his tablet. A shared activity. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked him. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully decode. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that the virus may not simply be carried by these animals. I'm thinking it may be influencing their behavior. Not pathologically, not the way it destroys human neurology, but subtly, directionally." He paused, making them more coordinated, more purposeful, more effective, Marcus said. Felix looked at him. "I was going to say organized." "Same thing," Marcus said. The rain stopped at midday as abruptly as it had started. The jungle steamed. Felix approached Elena while the others were preparing afternoon field kit and spoke quietly, his back to the camp. "I need to tell you something," he said. Elena waited. "Jean Vance," he said. "I told you I only knew them professionally. That was technically true, but not entirely complete." He looked at the river. 4 years ago, I reviewed a grant proposal for a Jean Vance subsidiary, primate behavioral research in the Amazon basin. I was a blind reviewer. I never knew the specific location or the full scope of the project, but the proposal described work with an unclassified primate population exhibiting unusual cognitive and social characteristics. He paused. The proposal was rejected by the grant committee. I recommended rejection myself because the methodology was insufficiently rigorous. I didn't know they proceeded anyway. Elena kept her voice even with considerable effort. What were they researching? The proposal was framed as behavioral ecology, Felix said. But the underlying interest, the thing they were really after, was the neurological basis of the animal's social coordination. They believed this population had evolved a communication system of unusual sophistication. They wanted to understand the biological mechanism. He finally looked at her. They weren't looking for a virus, Elena. They found the animals first. The virus came later. Which means they may have encountered it before the outbreak, Elena said, and left without reporting it, or reported it privately, to their corporate leadership. Felix's voice was carefully controlled. A 100% lethal novel pathogen with no current treatment, in the hands of a pharmaceutical company that strips its research station and disappears before the bodies start appearing in the villages. "Stop," Elena said. Felix stopped. "We're not building that theory without evidence," Elena said. "Not yet. But we're going to find evidence. We're going to that station this afternoon." She looked at him steadily. "And Felix, if there's anything else you haven't told me completely, now is the time." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "No," he said. "That's everything." She didn't believe him. She filed it and moved forward, because moving forward was the only option the jungle offered. The Jean Vance station was worse, in full examination, than Marcus had described. It was a serious facility, not a temporary field camp, but a constructed research outpost, with 3 interconnected, prefabricated modules, a reinforced laboratory unit, and infrastructure that spoke of long-term occupation. Solar panels, water filtration system, a communication array whose mounting bracket was still bolted to a Cecropia trunk, but whose hardware had been removed. The paths between modules had been laid with composite matting to keep them above the wet season flood level. Someone had invested significant resources in this place, and then removed every trace of what those resources had produced. The structural evacuation was thorough, But the jungle was more thorough. 8 months of equatorial growth had already begun reclaiming the margins, vines threading through ventilation gaps, root systems pushing at the base panels, a colony of leafcutter ants crossing the laboratory threshold in an unbroken line, carrying green fragments into the dark interior. Tomas found the first anomaly. He had been checking the perimeter of the station, following the edge of the cleared area, when he called them over without raising his voice. The quiet call of someone who has learned that some things shouldn't be announced loudly in the jungle. At the back of the main module, partially concealed by a growth of heliconias that had seeded themselves against the outer wall in the months since the station's abandonment, was a secondary entrance. A smaller door, reinforced steel, with a biometric lock panel whose screen was dark and dead. The door was open, not forced open, not decayed open, but standing ajar by approximately 30 centimeters, as though someone had passed through it and not pulled it closed behind them. Or something had pushed it open from the other side. Marcus went in first with a flashlight. The room beyond was not a laboratory. It was a containment unit, small, perhaps 4 by 6 meters, with walls of reinforced acrylic paneling, behind which had once sat environmental monitoring equipment. The equipment was gone, but the mounting brackets remained, and the floor still bore the chemical staining of cleaning agents used in biological containment protocols. Along one wall were 5 acrylic enclosures, each perhaps 60 centimeters square, built into the wall at chest height. 4 were empty. The 5th contained what remained of its last occupant. Raya stood in the doorway and went very still. The remains were primate. Small, juvenile, she assessed from the bone structure, visible beneath the desiccated tissue. The animal had been dead for months, the equatorial conditions accelerating decomposition to the point where soft tissue had largely reduced to a dark residue coating the bones. But the skeletal morphology was clear enough, and Raya was a good enough anatomist to read it. The proportions were wrong for any species she could identify. Too large for the age suggested by the bone density. The cranial structure was broader than expected. The hand bones, visible where they lay against the enclosure floor, showed a digit configuration she hadn't seen before. "That's one of ours," she said quietly. "One of the troop." She looked at the empty enclosures. They had 4 others. "Had," Marcus said. Raya looked at the door standing open 30 centimeters. "The others weren't removed by the research team," she said. The others left. Jin had moved to the corner of the room where something had caught his attention. He crouched and aimed his flashlight at the base of the wall, scratched into the composite surface. Not painted, not printed, but physically scratched by something hard and repeated, were a series of marks. They were organized, regular intervals, consistent depth, a pattern that repeated and varied in a way that was not random. "What is that?" Elena said, crouching beside him. Jin said nothing for a long moment. His pen had stopped. His notebook was open but motionless. "It looks like—" He stopped, started again. "The repetition rate and the variation pattern are consistent with—" He stopped again. "Jin," Elena said. "It looks like counting," he said. His voice was very flat. "Someone was counting in this room, keeping a record, making marks to represent quantity or time." He looked at the tool marks more closely with his flashlight. The instrument that made these marks was not a human hand. Silence in the small room, the rain-wet jungle outside, the faint chemical smell of old containment protocols, the dead juvenile in its enclosure. "We need to leave this station," Tomas said from the doorway. He was looking outward toward the jungle. His voice carried the specific quality Elena had learned to treat as important. "We need to leave it now." They were 40 meters from the station on the path back toward the river when Jin went down. No warning. One moment he was walking behind Eleanor, notebook in hand, pen moving. The next he made a short, involuntary sound and dropped to one knee, his hand going to his left forearm. Eleanor turned immediately. "What happened?" "Something." Jin's voice was tight. He was looking at his forearm. "I felt something. Through the suit." The suit was intact, no visible tear, but when Eleanor examined the fabric closely under her flashlight, she found it. A small penetration, less than 5 millimeters, barely visible. Not torn, pierced. Something had gone through the material cleanly. "Did you brush against a branch?" Marcus said, already moving, already scanning the trees above them. "I don't—" Jin swallowed. "I don't think it was a branch." Eleanor made herself work through the protocol rather than through the fear that was trying to supersede it. She sealed the penetration site on the suit with emergency patch tape from her kit. That first, always that first, and then carefully rolled back the inner layer to examine Jin's forearm. A single puncture wound, clean-edged, already beginning to redden at the margins, deep enough to bleed slightly, consistent with a large needle or, she did not say aloud, a primate canine tooth making contact at speed and angle with something less than full penetration force. "I need your vitals," she said, keeping her voice clinical. "Elena," Jin said. His voice had changed. The intellectual structure had cracked slightly, and what was beneath it was young and frightened. "I'm a data person. Give me data. What are my odds?" She looked at him for 3 seconds. In this moment, she was not his friend, not his colleague, not his team leader. She was the person who had to tell him the true thing, and the true thing was that no one who had been directly exposed to VZ1 through a wound event had survived. No one. "Your odds depend on what made that wound," she said. "We don't know yet what made that wound." "But if it was them? We don't know yet," she said again, firmly, the way you close a door. "What I know is that you're mobile, your vitals are baseline, and we have 4 days before extraction. We're going to monitor you every 2 hours, and we're going to work the problem." She held his eyes until she saw him accept this. "Can you walk?" He stood up. "Yes." "Then walk." They moved back to camp in close formation, Marcus at the rear, watching the canopy above them the entire way. He saw nothing, but 30 meters from camp, on a branch directly above the path they had traveled, he found 2 things when he looked closely enough. A faint disturbance in the lichen coating of the branch, consistent with a departure point, and a single dark hair, approximately 8 centimeters long, snagged on a piece of bark. He took the hair without mentioning it, and kept walking. The next 12 hours tested every seam in the team. Elena established Jin's monitoring protocol immediately. Temperature, blood pressure, and neurological assessment every 2 hours, logged against the VZ1 progression timeline she knew by heart. 6 hours in, his temperature was 37.4, marginally elevated, within the range of exertion and heat. 12 hours in, 37.8. Not conclusive. Not safe. The deceptive window of early infection was 12 hours. They were in it. Jin worked. He refused to stop working, which Eleanor permitted, because stillness would have been worse for him, and because the work he was doing mattered. He cross-referenced the marks in the Jean Vance containment room. He had photographed everything, with every symbolic and numerical notation system in his database. He ran spatial analysis on the troops' movement patterns. He built, in his precise, tiny handwriting, a model of what they knew and what it implied. Marcus spent the evening reinforcing the camp perimeter. He added a second rope line 2 meters inside the first, raised the motion sensors to a height that excluded ground-level fauna, and established a watch rotation that gave every team member a 90-minute alert shift throughout the night. He did all of this without announcing it as a response to threat, framing it instead as standard overnight protocol. But Elena watched him work and understood that Marcus had reclassified their situation. Tomas disappeared for 2 hours after dinner and came back with wet boots and information. "The troop has moved," he said, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. "Their range markers, the branch deposits, the territorial signs Raya has been cataloguing, have shifted north in the last 48 hours. They were ranging along the full tributary length. Now they are concentrated." He pointed to a section of the map approximately 3 kilometers north of camp. "Here, this section of the river where the secondary channel splits. There is high ground there. Good visibility. Good," he searched for the word, "command position." "You're describing a defensive formation," Marcus said. Tomas looked at him steadily. "I'm describing what I see. How do you know where their markers are?" Felix asked. His voice was measured, curious, entirely reasonable. "You were scouting after dinner?" "I have been scouting every evening," Tomas said, meeting Felix's gaze. "Since the first day. I know this river. I know how to move in it without being heard or seen." "And yet you weren't going to share this information until now?" Felix said. "I am sharing it now," Tomas said. The two men looked at each other in a way that was not hostile but was not comfortable, and Elena filed it alongside everything else she was filing and running parallel processing on while managing Jin's monitoring schedule and preparing the morning's sample analysis and calculating extraction timelines. "Tomas," she said, "is there anything else you know about this area that you haven't told us?" The guide was quiet for a moment. The jungle filled the silence helpfully. Then he said, "My brother lived in Boca do Sombra." Nobody moved. "He was a rubber tapper," Tomas continued, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is proceeding through it with discipline. "He sent me a message 3 months ago. He described strange animals near the village, animals he didn't recognize. He described their behavior, the way they moved together, the way they seemed to watch the settlement." He paused. "He described them the way Raya describes them. I did not understand the message when I received it. I do now." "Your brother," Elena said carefully. "Is he was in Boca do Sombra when it went silent," Tomas said. He looked at the map. "That is why I am here. I told the army coordinator I was available for the mission. I did not tell them why." He looked up. "I am sorry I did not say this before. It did not change what we are doing. It only changes why I am doing it." Elena thought about that for a moment. She thought about what it meant. A man carrying a brother's disappearance into the jungle that took him, working a mission with the only people who might produce an answer. She thought about whether it compromised his judgment or sharpened it. "It doesn't change anything," she said finally. "You're still our guide. You know this river better than anyone alive." She paused. "But from now on, what you know, we know, immediately. Agreed?" Tomas nodded once. "Agreed." Felix watched this exchange from his position at the edge of the group. His expression was sympathetic, collegial, completely appropriate. Elena looked at him and looked away and thought about the grant review he had forgotten to mention until it became unavoidable, and the tablet that was always face down now when it had never been face down before. Day 6. Jin's temperature, 38.2. Elena recorded it without expression and told him it was borderline and that they were continuing to monitor. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who knew what borderline meant in this context and was managing his response to that knowledge with considerable courage. He asked for more data to process. She gave him everything they had. Felix pulled her aside at mid-morning. "We need to discuss extraction," he said. "If Jin is progressing, he may not be progressing," Elena said. "The wound may not have been an animal contact event. We don't—" "Elena." Felix's voice was patient in a way that wasn't kind. A 38.2 temperature after a penetrating wound in a VZ1 active zone is not something we reason away with, may not. If we wait for confirmation that he's infected, we lose the extraction window. The helicopter can reach us in 4 hours. If we call it now, we lose everything," Elena said. "No specimen, no confirmed transmission data, no field evidence of the Gene-Vance connection. Everything we've found so far is suggestive, but not sufficient. The WHO will not commit to a containment operation based on what we have. More people will die. And if Jin dies in this jungle because we stayed, then that is a tragedy I will carry," Elena said. "But Jin knew the risk. Every person on this team knew the risk. We have 2 days before our extraction window, and we are going to use them." She met Felix's eyes. "Unless you have a specific reason why we shouldn't." The pause was very small, barely a gap, but Eleanor felt it. "No," Felix said. "No specific reason. The attack came on the evening of day 6, not the cautious peripheral movement of the previous nights, not the turned sensor, not the displaced branch, not the unseen presence at the tree line. This was direct and rapid, and came from 3 directions simultaneously, which was the detail that would keep Marcus awake for the rest of the mission. The simultaneous approach from 3 coordinated positions, the kind of tactical geometry that you planned in advance. The motion sensors triggered at 9:14 p.m., all 3 outer sensors within 4 seconds of each other. Marcus was out of his tent and at the perimeter in 8 seconds, flashlight and sidearm, calling the team to position as he moved. The first animal came through the rope line on the eastern side, moving fast and low, and Marcus saw it clearly for the first time in the beam of his flashlight. It was larger than the footage had suggested. 40 kilograms at least, he estimated. Not the small primates he'd been unconsciously picturing. The face was broad and flat, the eyes catching the flashlight with a reflective quality that threw back twin points of orange light. It moved with a speed and fluency that was deeply wrong in something that large. No hesitation, no threat display, no warning behavior. It came in like something that had decided. Marcus fired once into the ground directly in front of it. The animal stopped. It stopped, and it looked at him, at the gun. And then it looked at him again. Not in the panicked freeze of an animal encountering loud noise, in the evaluating pause of something calculating new information. Then it retreated. Not running, withdrawing, controlled, backward, maintaining eye contact until the jungle took it. On the northern perimeter, Raya and Tomas had converged on 2 animals that had approached the inner rope line and stopped there. Stopped exactly at the rope, as though the boundary itself was understood. They stood facing the camp for 6 seconds after Raya's flashlight hit them, then turned and disappeared. The western sensor had triggered and then gone silent. When Marcus checked it, the sensor was intact. The ground below showed tracks that approached to within 1 meter of the perimeter rope and turned back. Whatever had come from the west had reached the edge of the camp boundary and chosen not to cross it. "They tested us," Marcus said. Back in the camp center, the team clustered under the laboratory tarpaulin. His voice was even. 3 simultaneous approach vectors. They hit all 3 at once to split our response and assess our positions. He looked at the gun in his hand, and then at Elena. "I've seen this in insurgent contact doctrine. I have not seen it in an animal encounter." Jin, seated with his temperature log in front of him, his face pale in the lantern light, said quietly, "The marks in the containment room. I ran them against temporal notation systems." He turned his notebook to show the page. "The variation pattern is consistent with a counting system, specifically a system for recording the passage of time. Days, I think, or cycles." He looked up. They were counting how long they'd been in that room. Whatever gene Vance had in those enclosures, whatever they were doing to those animals, the animals were keeping track. The lantern swayed in a breath of wind that came from somewhere. "They know we're here," Tomas said. "They have known since the first day." He looked at each of them in turn. "And they have been deciding what to do about us." Elena looked at the tree line beyond the perimeter, the familiar wall of darkness, alive with its usual sounds, its usual movements, its usual illusion of neutrality. Then she looked at Jin's temperature log. Then she looked at Felix, who was looking at his tablet, which was finally face up. On its screen, she caught a partial glimpse before he turned it over again. The corner of an email interface, a corporate header, blue and white, before the screen went dark. She said nothing. She logged everything, and she began planning for a tomorrow that she suspected none of them were fully prepared for. Day 7 began with a gift. That was how Elena would later describe it. And later, when she had the distance to examine it honestly, she would recognize the gift for what it actually was. Bait. Not laid consciously, perhaps, not by a human hand, but bait nonetheless, offered by a situation that had been building toward a specific outcome and needed one more piece in position before it could complete itself. The gift arrived at 6 a.m. in the form of a dead animal at the edge of the camp perimeter. Marcus found it during his dawn check of the rope line. A single individual from the troop, lying on its side in the leaf litter, 2 meters outside the outer boundary, its large hands loosely curled, its broad face turned toward the camp as though it had lain down to watch and simply not gotten up again. No visible wounds, no sign of predation. It had died, apparently, of natural causes in the night. He called Elena immediately, and she came with her kit, heart rate elevated in the way that competent people's heart rates elevate when the thing they need most unexpectedly appears. "Don't touch it without full PPE," she said, unnecessary instruction to herself as much as anyone. She was already pulling on gloves over gloves, sealing her sleeves. She crouched beside the animal and conducted a systematic external examination, while Raya stood behind her, recording on the camera, and Jin sat in his camp chair 10 meters away with his temperature log and watched with eyes that were doing more work than his face showed. His temperature that morning was 38.6. Elena was holding the knowledge of that number in a sealed compartment while she worked. The animal was adult female, she assessed, the largest she had seen up close, consistent with the track evidence suggesting females in this troop were unusually large relative to the males. The morphology confirmed everything Raya had described from her observation platform. The cranial structure, the digit configuration, the coloring, the charcoal gray of the body fur, the distinctive reddish-brown crown patch that had no analog in her database, and the eyes. Open, dark, with that quality of intelligence that didn't diminish in death, only became still. "I need blood and tissue," Elena said, "and a saliva sample from the oral cavity." She looked at Raya. "Can you assist?" Raya crouched beside her without hesitation. Felix appeared at Elena's shoulder. "I should be doing this," he said. "Primary pathogen collection should be the virologist's. You're documenting," Elena said, without looking up. She passed him the secondary camera. "Everything I do, every sample I take, with time stamp. Start now." He documented, and she collected, working with the focus that crises sometimes produce, the narrowing of attention to the immediate procedural task, each step clear and correct and stripped of the peripheral noise of everything else. Blood from the femoral vessel, tissue from the deltoid, a careful swab of the oral cavity, the animal's lips drawn back with an instrument to reveal the dentition. And there it was, the canine teeth, longer than she'd expected, with a slight recurved shape that would maximize penetration depth in a bite event and a surface texture that would hold fluid against the skin. She took the saliva sample and sealed it and labeled it and set it in the collection case and sat back on her heels for a moment. "This is it," Jin said from his chair. His voice was quiet, but carried the precision he brought to everything. "If VZ1 is in that saliva at the concentration we found on the branch, if it's in the blood, that's your confirmed transmission vector." "We process it first," Elena said. "We confirm before we conclude." But even as she said it, she felt it. The shift that happens when a scientific pursuit moves from seeking to finding, the particular quality of completion that comes when a hypothesis becomes a fact. She had been in enough crisis situations to know what it felt like when you had the answer. This felt like that. The field kit processed the samples in 4 hours. They were the longest 4 hours of the mission. Elena used them to write her preliminary report, the careful, conditional language of scientific documentation that nonetheless built, sentence by sentence, toward an unambiguous conclusion. Felix reviewed Jin's epidemiological model for the 4th time and made 2 small notations that he presented as corrections and which Elena recognized as the additions of someone ensuring their name was attached to the analytical framework before it was transmitted. She permitted this because there were more important things to manage. Jin worked until his hands shook. Then he stopped working and sat very still, which was worse. When the results came through, Eleanor read them standing up, which she would not have been able to explain if asked. VZ1, RNA, present in blood sample. Concentration, extremely high, consistent with an animal in which the virus was not pathogenic, but actively replicating and maintained at peak infectious load. VZ1 RNA, present in saliva sample. Concentration, high, specifically elevated in the submandibular gland secretions coating the canine surfaces. The animal was a living viral delivery system. When it bit, it didn't merely wound, it injected. Not deliberately, in any conscious sense. But the biological architecture of the transmission was as precise as engineering. She called the team together. "We have confirmation," she said. The words felt large and flat at the same time, the way important words sometimes do. She walked them through the results: concentration levels, transmission pathway, the saliva distribution along the canine surface. Jin was right behind her with the epidemiological correlation, and Felix with the viral characterization data, and Raya with the behavioral evidence, and by the time they had finished presenting, it was not a hypothesis, but a case. The Sombra troop is the primary transmission vector for VZ1. Bite events are the main infection pathway. Environmental surface contamination is a secondary risk. There is no evidence of human-to-human transmission. She looked at each of them. "We have what we came for." The relief in the camp was physical. She felt it move through the group like a pressure change, shoulders dropping, breathing shifting, the particular relaxation of people who have been carrying a specific weight and have set it down. Even Marcus, whose expression had been calibrated to neutral for 6 days, allowed something to ease around his eyes. "I'm calling for extraction," Elena said. "Primary window opens in 36 hours. I'll request early deployment. We should be out of here by tomorrow evening." She reached for the satellite phone, and Jin said, "My temperature is 39.1. The number reorganized everything. 39.1 was no longer borderline. 39.1, in the context of a penetrating wound event in an active VZ1 zone on day 7 of a 48 to 72-hour progression timeline, was a diagnosis. Elena put the satellite phone down and picked up her medical kit and went to Jin and conducted the assessment with the thoroughness of someone who needed the process to produce a different result and knew it wouldn't. Temperature confirmed, blood pressure elevated, slight photosensitivity in both eyes. He was reporting joint pain in his left shoulder and hip that he had not mentioned in his previous self-assessments because, he said with the ghost of his usual precision, he had categorized it as exertion-related and had not wanted to introduce confounding variables into the monitoring data. She sat back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the conversation that passed between them in that silence was the most honest one they'd had. "How long?" he asked. "We don't know exactly how long you've been progressing," she said. "The wound happened 36 hours ago. If the progression began immediately..." She calculated. 12 to 36 hours remaining in the moderate phase. Then the hemorrhagic phase. Yes. Jin was quiet for a moment. "Call the extraction," he said. "Right now. Don't wait for the window." "I'm going to," Elena said. "But Jin, don't tell me we're going to find something in the next 12 hours that reverses this," he said. Gently, not bitterly. "I'm a data person. The data says there are no survivors from confirmed VZ1 infection." He paused. "What I want is to do useful work with the time I have. Put me on the analysis. Let me keep building the model. If I can give the next team something..." "You have already given the next team everything," Elena said. Her voice held. He nodded once and turned back to his notebook. Elena stood and walked to the perimeter edge and called the extraction on the satellite phone in the clear, calm voice she had developed over years of delivering news in situations that required the voice to be clear and calm, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. She requested immediate deployment. Priority medical evacuation. One critical patient, the Air Force coordinator confirmed, helicopter ETA 14 hours, limited to daylight approach, earliest arrival 7 a.m. day 8, 14 hours. It was Felix who found it. Elena would think about this later. She would think about the timing of it, the precision of when it surfaced, and she would not be able to determine with certainty whether the discovery was genuine or whether it was a controlled revelation. Information released at a specific moment to produce a specific effect. She would think about this and not reach a conclusion that satisfied her, which was its own kind of answer. He came to her at 11 p.m. with his tablet, face up this time, turned toward her immediately, and showed her what was on the screen without preamble. It was a document, a research summary, 12 pages, formatted in Gene Vance's internal template. The header read, "Sombra Project, Phase 2, Summary, Classified, Distribution Limited." "Where did this come from?" Elena said. "The station," Felix said, "when Marcus and I were there. I found a data chip concealed in the base of the environmental monitoring bracket, one of the few pieces of equipment they didn't remove. It's been encrypted. I've been working the decryption since we returned." A pause. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't. I was..." He appeared to consider the word. "Cautious about what it might contain and what obligations it would create." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the document. She read it standing up again. The Sombra project had begun not 8 months ago, but 4 years ago. Gene Vance had identified the troop 2 years before that and had been conducting remote observation before establishing the field station. The initial research interest had been exactly what Felix described from the grant proposal: the neurological basis of the troop's unusual social coordination. What the Phase 2 summary described was something else. Gene Vance researchers had isolated VZ1 from the troop 18 months ago. They had characterized it fully: full genome sequence, transmission pathway, lethality profile. They had known exactly what it was and what it did. They had also identified something that made Eleanor's hand stop moving on the tablet screen. In a small subpopulation of the troop, the document noted 7 confirmed individuals. The viral load showed a distinct molecular variation, a natural mutation occurring within the endemic viral population that produced a modified protein structure on the viral surface. The researchers had designated this variant VZ1M. The modification was significant. In the 7 individuals carrying VZ1M, the immune response profile was different, not absent. The variant was still present and replicating, but the host immune system was producing a partial antibody response, not sufficient to clear the infection, but sufficient to suggest a pathway. VZ1M was the beginning of a vaccine target. Gene Vance had known this, had characterized it, sequenced it, and prepared to develop it. And then, the final pages of the summary made clear the company had made a calculation. The outbreak in the villages had not been an accident they were trying to prevent. It had been a data set they were allowing to develop. Real-world lethality confirmation, transmission rate data from natural exposure events, epidemiological spread patterns that would take years to generate in a controlled trial. They had known the villages were being affected. They had withdrawn. They had waited. Because a pharmaceutical company that arrives with a vaccine for an outbreak, it predicted, documented, and patented before the first public case, owns that market absolutely. Elena set the tablet down. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the jungle sounds outside, and Jin in his tent, and the helicopter that was 14 hours away. She was aware of Felix watching her, and of the fact that Felix had been reviewing that encrypted document for days and had chosen this moment, post-extraction call, post-confirmation of Jin's infection, to share it. They have a vaccine target, she said. A preliminary one, Felix said. The VZ1M variant, if we can obtain samples from one of the 7 carrier individuals. That's why you didn't want to call for extraction, Elena said. Her voice was quiet. That's why you've been arguing to stay, to get samples, to push the timeline. You knew what was on this chip. Felix said nothing. Are you working for Gene Vance? Elena said. No, he said, immediately and without flinching. I am not. I reviewed their grant proposal 4 years ago, and when I realized what they were doing here, I needed to understand it fully before I said anything. That was wrong, I know that. But Eleanor, he picked up the tablet and turned it back to face her. VZ1M. If one of those 7 animals is in this troop, and if we can obtain a blood sample, a single blood sample, we give the world a vaccine pathway. We don't wait for Gene Vance to release their data on their timeline for their profit. We publish it openly. We hand it to the WHO tonight. He paused. Jin is dying. The people in those villages are dead. This one sample could mean that nobody else dies. Elena looked at the document, at the genome map of VZ1M, at the antibody pathway diagram that represented months of Gene Vance research that had been built on a foundation of deliberate inaction while people died. She looked at the dead animal they had sampled that morning, already sealed in the collection case. The animal we sampled this morning, she said slowly. Felix nodded. I cross-referenced the morphological photographs from your external examination with the individual identification notes in the Gene Vance summary, the crown patch coloring, the specific distribution pattern. He brought up a side-by-side comparison on the tablet. The animal that died at our perimeter last night is one of the 7. The jungle breathed outside. Somewhere in the dark, the troop moved through the canopy in its coordinated silence, 30 or 50 individuals carrying their ancient viral passenger through a forest that was burning at its edges, while the world that had built those edges watched and calculated and waited. And the sample, the one sample that could unravel everything Gene Vance had built, was already in their collection case. They already had it. Elena picked up the satellite phone again. Not to call the extraction coordinator. To call the WHO emergency line, the number she had memorized 10 years ago and hoped never to use. "This is Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, when the line connected. "I am transmitting an encrypted data package from the field. I need it in front of the Director General within the hour." She looked at Felix, who was watching her with an expression that she still could not fully read. "I also need you to open an investigation into Gene Vance Biosolutions. I'll explain when I transmit. Stand by." She began composing the transmission. Outside, at the perimeter, one of the motion sensors triggered, then went still, then triggered again. This time, Marcus didn't go to check it. He stood in the center of camp and looked at the tree line and understood, in the way that soldiers understand things their analytical mind hasn't caught up with yet, that the 14 hours until extraction was not going to be the calm waiting period that the word waiting implied. Something had changed in the jungle in the last hour. He didn't know how he knew. He knew. "Nobody sleeps tonight," he said to the camp at large. "Full watch. All positions." Elena kept typing. Jin, in his tent, was still writing in his notebook by flashlight, his handwriting smaller and more precise than ever, as though he were trying to fit everything he knew into the space he had left. And in the canopy above the camp, in the darkness between the uppermost branches, where the stars were occasionally visible through gaps in the leaves, things moved. Many things. Patient, coordinated, and no longer simply watching. The first sensor triggered at 2 a.m., then the second, then all of them, every motion sensor on both perimeter lines firing within a 6-second window, the electronic chirping overlapping into a single sustained alarm that brought everyone out of their tents and into the center of camp simultaneously, flashlights cutting the darkness in every direction. Marcus was already at the outer rope, weapon drawn. They were everywhere. Not the cautious peripheral presence of the previous nights. Not the single probing approach of the attack on day 6. The troop had arrived in force. Marcus counted 17 individuals visible in the beam of his flashlight before the number stopped, meaning anything useful. They ringed the camp on 3 sides, positioned in the mid-canopy, and at ground level simultaneously. The coordinated 2-tier formation of something that had thought about how to surround a position and acted on that thought. They were not moving. They were watching. "Nobody fires," Elena said from behind him. Her voice was controlled. "Nobody fires unless they cross the inner line." "And when they cross the inner line," Marcus said, "then we have a different conversation." The standoff lasted 4 minutes. Marcus counted, because counting was something to do with the part of his mind that wasn't running tactical calculations. 4 minutes of stillness, of flashlight beams and reflected orange eyes, of the jungle making its sounds around and beneath and above the silence of 50 animals that had decided not to make a sound. Then the lead individual, the large male Elena had seen on Raya's footage, the one that had stopped and assessed and directed, dropped from its branch to the ground. Outside the outer perimeter, it landed without sound, stood upright briefly in a way that sent a cold current through everyone watching, and then settled to a quadrupedal stance. It looked at the camp, at Marcus specifically, with the recognition of something that remembered the gun and had made calculations about it. Then it turned and walked north. Slowly, deliberately. 20 meters into the darkness, it stopped and looked back. "It wants us to follow," Raya said. Her voice was strange, not frightened, but altered, carrying the quality of someone watching something that was reorganizing their understanding of the world in real time. "Absolutely not," Marcus said. "Marcus." Following a pack of infected primates into the jungle at 2 a.m. is not a course of action I'm going to approve, Marcus said. That is not tactical caution. That is basic. They could have crossed the perimeter an hour ago, Tomas said quietly. They chose not to. He was looking at the lead male, still waiting in the darkness. This one was at the station. It was in the containment room. He paused. It knows what a research facility is. It knows what we are. "You're suggesting it understands we're here to help," Felix said. "I'm suggesting it understands we're different from the people who put it in a box," Tomas said. The lead male waited. What happened next would occupy Elena's thinking for the rest of her life, not with regret, but with the particular weight of decisions that couldn't have been made differently and still had to be lived with. She went. Marcus went with her because the alternative was letting her go alone. Raya went because Raya was not built for staying. Tomas went because it was his jungle and his brother, and he had always been going from the moment he took this mission. Felix stayed with Jin, which Elena told him to do, and which he accepted without argument, and which she chose not to examine too carefully in the moment. They followed the lead male north along the riverbank, flashlights low, moving in single file with Tomas at the front, reading the ground. The animal maintained a consistent distance, never closer than 15 meters, never far enough to lose in the darkness. It moved at a pace they could match, which Elena noted and could not stop noting. It was leading them at a human walking pace through terrain it could have crossed at 3 times the speed. 6 minutes. 400 meters, the river narrowing beside them, the trees pressing closer, the darkness thickening. Then the lead male stopped and made the sound. The 3-register vocalization Raya had described from her observation platform. Low, complex, structured. The jungle around them changed, not the vegetation, the population within it. Animals that had been invisible became present, materializing from the dark spaces between trees, dropping from branches, emerging from the undergrowth in a movement so synchronized it looked choreographed. The full troop, or most of it, arranged in a rough circle around a central space that the flashlights, when they swept it, revealed as a natural clearing where a massive fallen cecropia had created a gap in the canopy. Moonlight fell through it in a pale column. In the center of the clearing were bodies. Human bodies. 4 of them, arranged. And Eleanor used that word in her mind with full clinical awareness of its implications. Arranged in a row, parallel, with the careful spacing of something that had observed how humans organized their dead. Tomas made a sound that was not a word and moved forward before Marcus could stop him. Elena caught his arm. "Gloves," she said. "Tomas. Gloves first." He stopped. He put on gloves. He went to the bodies and crouched and looked at each face, and when he came to the 4th, he was still for a long time. "My brother," he said. The other 3 were in Gene Vance field gear, researchers, based on the equipment still attached to their vests. Young. The same vascular blackening, the same hemorrhagic evidence in the dried staining around their eyes. They had been dead for weeks, but they had not been here. They had been somewhere else, and the troop had brought them here, tonight, for the team to find. Elena stood in the moonlit clearing, surrounded by 50 animals carrying a lethal virus, and looked at 4 dead men, and felt the shape of what was being communicated to her, arriving fully formed and devastating in its simplicity. The troop hadn't been attacking the villages. They had been drawn to them. The flashback came to her the way crucial understandings sometimes come, not as a new thought, but as an old one finally arriving at its correct meaning. The behavior Raya had described from her first observation, the coordinated movement, the deliberate pacing, the lead male's assessment from the branch. She had framed it as predatory intelligence, as tactical organization directed outward at human targets. But the troop had surrounded the villages in the same way they had surrounded the camp, not to attack, but to observe, to be near. The infected humans in the villages hadn't been randomly encountered victims. They had been sought out. VZ1, in its endemic form within the troop, produced the neurological heightening that made the animals more coordinated, more communicative, more cognitively capable. The virus was not a passenger in the troop's biology. It was a participant. It had co-evolved with them over generations to enhance the very neural architecture it occupied, creating hosts that were increasingly effective at maintaining and spreading it. And now, in humans, in the wrong host, with the wrong neurological structure, the wrong immune response, the same enhancement protocol became a destruction sequence. The aggression in the final stage wasn't random pathological behavior. It was the virus running its enhancement program in a system that couldn't withstand it. The troop came to the villages because VZ1 oriented them toward humans, not as prey, as potential hosts, as the next population in which the virus was trying to establish its endemic state. Every bite was the virus attempting to find a new home. It had not found one yet. Every human host had died, but the mathematics of evolution required only time and volume, enough exposures, enough variation, and eventually a human immune system would respond the way the VZ1M carriers in the troop had responded. Partial resistance, accommodation, the beginning of a new endemic state. Jean Vance had understood this, had modeled it, probably, in the stripped servers of the abandoned station, had recognized that they were watching a virus in the active process of expanding its host range across a species barrier, and had made their calculation accordingly. Elena looked at the bodies of the Jean Vance researchers. "They came back," she said aloud. Raya looked at her. After they evacuated the station, someone came back. A field team. Elena gestured at the Jean Vance gear. They came back for something. Samples, maybe. The VZ1M carriers. She looked at the lead male, still at the edge of the clearing, watching. And the troop found them. "Bit them," Marcus said. "Or the researchers made contact without adequate protection," Raya said slowly, trying to collect samples, trying to get what they needed. She looked at the bodies. The troop brought them here for the same reason they brought us here, to show us. "To show us what?" Marcus said. Raya looked at him, then at the lead male, then at the clearing, at the arrangement of the bodies, at the intentionality of every element of what they were standing in the middle of. "That they know what's happening," she said. "To them, to the humans, to both populations." Her voice was quiet and certain, in the way that only arrived after long professional experience confirmed something previously theoretical. The viral enhancement isn't just coordination and communication. These animals understand cause and effect across time. They understand that the bites produce deaths. They understand that the deaths are connected to them. She paused. They have been trying to communicate this. The marks in the containment room. The dead female left at our perimeter, following us to the villages instead of attacking us. They wanted to stop, Tomas said. He was still crouching beside his brother. His voice was level, in the way of a person who has decided to grieve later and function now. They don't want to keep killing people. They don't understand how to stop. The clearing was silent, except for the jungle and 50 animals breathing in the dark. Marcus lowered his weapon to his side, not holstering it. He was not that different a person than he'd been 5 minutes ago, but lowering it, which was a statement of its own kind. The impossible choice had been building since the moment Eleanor had read the VZ1M data on Felix's tablet, and she had known it was coming and had not let herself look at it directly. Now it was in front of her, in a moonlit clearing with dead men in it, and Tomas's brother among them, and there was no more time. The sample from the dead female was in the collection case back at camp. VZ1M. Confirmed. The vaccine pathway, in a sealed tube, waiting for a helicopter that was 9 hours away. But the dead female had been one of 7 VZ1M carriers. One sample gave the WHO a sequence. Multiple samples gave them a complete characterization, variant spread within the population, stability range, full antibody pathway mapping. The difference between one sample and 7 was the difference between a promising lead and a development-ready target. The other 6 carriers were in the trees around her. She could not take samples from living animals without capture, which required equipment they didn't have, and time they didn't have, and a level of exposure risk that the protocol she had built this mission on did not permit. But there was something else. The Gene Vance summary had included individual identification notes, physical markers for each of the 7 carriers, and the troop was here, around her, visible, because the lead male had brought them here, because the lead male was one of the 7. She looked at him across the clearing, at his broad face, his steady dark eyes, his particular reddish-brown crown patch, whose distribution she had matched to the Gene Vance photographs 2 hours ago, without saying it aloud to Felix, because the implication required thinking through before speaking. A blood sample. From a living animal that was standing 15 meters away, and had, by every behavioral indicator available to her, demonstrated that it understood the difference between cooperation and threat. She reached into a kit and removed a sample collection tool, a small spring-loaded lancet designed for large mammal field sampling, a puncture, a collection strip, a seal, 3 seconds of contact. She looked at Marcus. He looked at the lancet, at the lead male, back at her. "No," he said. "Marcus, the answer is no, Elena. You go within reach of that animal, and I cannot protect you." "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I'm asking you to trust my assessment." "Your assessment of what? Of a predator carrying a 100% lethal pathogen that has killed everyone who's come into contact with it?" "My assessment of what that animal has demonstrated in the last 7 days," she said. "The perimeter it didn't cross, the sensor it rotated instead of destroyed, the female it left at our border. These bodies, arranged, Marcus, deliberately placed for us to find." She held his eyes. "This animal has been conducting a negotiation with us since day 1. I want to complete it," Raya said, very quietly. "I'll do it." Both Elena and Marcus looked at her. "I'm the wildlife specialist," Raya said. "If this is a behavioral assessment, it's my assessment to make, and my assessment is—" She looked at the lead male across the clearing, at the absolute stillness with which it had been watching them conduct this argument, that it already knows something is about to happen. And it's still here. The lead male was still here. Elena made the decision she would think about for the rest of her life. "Raya," she said, Full PPE. Approach vector from the left. Move slowly. Stay low. No sudden movements. If it shows any sign of—" "I know," Raya said. She crossed the clearing alone. The troop watched. 50 animals, motionless, a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat competing with the jungle sounds. Raya moved the way she had always moved in the field, not with the caution of fear, but with the respect of knowledge, the measured approach of someone who had spent 11 years learning how not to be a threat. She closed the distance in 2 minutes of careful movement, her flashlight off, working by moonlight, until she was 4 meters away, and then 3, and then 2. The lead male watched her come. 1 meter. He did not move, did not shift his weight, or adjust his posture, or telegraph the explosive departure that Marcus's hands were white-knuckle, ready to respond to from across the clearing. Raya crouched to his level. She showed him the lancet, held it in front of her where he could see it, the way you show your hands, the way you communicate that what you're holding is small and defined, and the only thing you're carrying. He looked at it. The intelligent, assessing look that Elena had seen in Raya's footage, and that was more confronting in person than in any recording. Then Raya reached forward, slowly, and pressed the lancet gently to the back of his hand. The spring mechanism clicked. The lead male flinched. A precise, controlled flinch, the reaction to pain rather than threat, and then was still again. Raya pressed the collection strip to the puncture. 3 seconds. She withdrew, capped the sample, and stood slowly. The lead male looked at his hand, then at her, then at Eleanor across the clearing. Then he made the 3-register vocalization, and the troop dissolved into the jungle, smoothly, completely, in under 30 seconds, until the clearing held only the team and the bodies of 4 dead men, and the moonlight coming through the Cecropia gap, and the sound of the river moving somewhere in the dark. Raya walked back across the clearing. She placed the sample in Elena's kit. Her hands were completely steady. "Let's go back to Jin," she said. Felix was gone when they returned to camp. His tent was empty, his tablet was gone, his sample bag was gone. The collection case, the primary collection case containing the dead female's blood and tissue samples and the original VZ1M confirmation, was open and empty. Elena stood and looked at the open case for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the satellite phone and called 2 numbers in sequence. The WHO emergency line, to tell them that the data package she had transmitted an hour ago was the complete record and that a duplicate physical sample set had been compromised, and the extraction coordinator to request that the incoming helicopter be met by Brazilian Federal Police. She did both of these things in the clear, level voice. Then she sat down next to Jin, who was awake and whose eyes showed the first faint threading of dark at the scleral margins that meant the deceptive window was closing, and she took his hand and held it, and didn't perform any particular expression. "Did we get what we needed?" he asked. She thought about the transmitted data package, already in WHO servers. The VZ1M sequence, the full viral characterization, the gene Vance documentation, the antibody pathway. Everything on record, time-stamped, publicly attributed, before anyone could bury it. She thought about the sample in her kit, Raya's sample, the living blood of a carrier, more complete than anything in the original collection case. She thought about Felix moving through the jungle toward the river, with a case full of samples he believed were the only copies. "Yes," she said, "we got what we needed." Jin nodded and closed his eyes, and kept breathing. 8 hours and 40 minutes until the helicopter. Dr. Jin Park died at 5:53 a.m., 14 minutes before the helicopter arrived. He died the way he had lived the final days of his mission, working. His notebook was open in his lap, the last entry, a clean summary of the VZ1M antibody pathway, written in his smallest, most precise handwriting, as though he had known space was limited and had been economical with it. His final data point, recorded in the margin at 5:41 a.m. in a hand that had begun to lose its steadiness, was his own temperature. 41.2, followed by a single word in Korean that Tomas, who did not speak Korean, nonetheless recognized as the kind of word that is the same in every language. Enough. Elena sat with him until the helicopter landed, and then she stood up and did what the mission required, because Jin Park had spent his last hours doing what the mission required, and she was not going to honor that with anything less. They airlifted out at 6:07 a.m. into a sky that was turning from black to the deep blue that precedes equatorial dawn, that specific color that exists for perhaps 15 minutes each morning over the Amazon before the heat burns it away. Elena watched it through the helicopter window and did not look at the jungle below, and then looked at it anyway, because looking away felt like a lie. The canopy stretched in every direction, without interruption. 40 million square kilometers of living complexity, breathing slowly in the morning mist, indifferent to the small drama that had played out at its edges. The river was a silver thread below them, catching the early light, leading back toward a world that was already preparing its response to the data package Elena had transmitted, briefings being called, laboratories being mobilized, pharmaceutical patents being quietly reviewed by WHO legal teams who had received certain Gene Vance documentation in the middle of the night and were not having a pleasant morning. Thomas sat at the far end of the helicopter with his brother's personal effects in a canvas bag on his lap. A watch, a wallet, a small photograph that Eleanor had not looked at closely enough to describe. He looked out the window at the river below. His face was the face of a man who had found what he came to find and paid the price that finding it cost, and who was still in the middle of deciding what to do with both of those facts. She would learn months later that he had returned to the Amazon, not as a guide, as an advocate, working with indigenous river communities to establish buffer zones around the Sombra tributary, partnering with the Brazilian Environmental Authority to document and protect the troops' range. He never discussed what he had seen in the clearing. He never needed to. Raya slept for the first time in 36 hours, her head against the vibrating hull, her field notebook still in her hand, the footage from her camera, the 7 days of behavioral documentation, the clearing, the sample collection, would become the foundation of a landmark paper published 8 months later in Nature under her name and Eleanor's. It would reframe the scientific understanding of viral coevolution and primate cognition simultaneously, generating the kind of academic controversy that produces careers and ends others. Raya would spend 3 years defending it before the evidence made defense unnecessary. She would also spend 3 years not talking about the moment she crossed a clearing in moonlight toward an animal that could have killed her, and chose not to. Felix Hartmann was arrested at a river supply depot 40 kilometers downstream, attempting to arrange private transport to Manaus. He had the original collection case. The samples were intact, which mattered for the legal proceedings and did not matter for anything else, because the data had already been transmitted and the science was already moving, and Gene Vance's carefully constructed timeline had already collapsed. The corporate investigation took 18 months. It produced criminal charges in 3 jurisdictions. It did not produce justice in any form that Elena recognized as the thing the word was supposed to mean, which she had expected, and which disappointed her anyway. Felix, in his testimony, maintained that he had intended to ensure the samples reached proper research facilities, and had not trusted the WHO transmission to be sufficient. It was the kind of argument that was sophisticated enough to be partly believed, and not sophisticated enough to change the outcome. He was a brilliant scientist who had made a series of calculations that each seemed defensible in isolation and were collectively unforgivable. Elena understood this and didn't forgive him, which she was at peace with. The VZ1 vaccine entered Phase 3 trials 11 months after extraction. Raya's sample, the living blood of the lead male, collected in a moonlit clearing in a negotiation that had no name in any scientific protocol, provided the complete VZ1M characterization that compressed the development timeline by an estimated 2 years. No new human cases were reported after the containment operation deployed to the Sombra tributary. Whether this was because the operation was successful, or because the troops' behavior changed, or because of something in the viral dynamics that the models hadn't fully captured, remained a question that the published literature answered with careful hedging, and Eleanor answered privately, with a memory of a large animal watching her across a clearing and making a sound in 3 registers that she had heard described as a directive. She believed it was something closer to an agreement. She went back once. 6 months after extraction, she arranged a survey permit through channels that required patience and institutional goodwill she had been accumulating for 15 years. She went alone, except for a river guide who was not Tomas, and who knew only that she wanted to observe primate populations along the upper Sombra tributary. She sat on the riverbank for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, at the edge of the water, she found a single fresh branch laid parallel to the bank, deliberately placed, recently deposited, with no wind or floodwater to account for its position. No tracks in the mud beside it. No sound from the canopy. The branch was clean. No residue. No dark staining. No viral trace on its surface. She tested it because she was a scientist, because she needed the data to mean what she thought it meant. Negative. She sat with that for a long time, watching the river move south toward the world it fed into, the cities and the laboratories and the courtrooms and the headlines, and all the loud human machinery that had been set in motion by what happened in this jungle, and would continue moving long after the jungle had returned to its own concerns. Then she picked up the branch and held it, and understood, with the specific clarity that comes rarely and stays permanently, that what had happened here would never be fully known by anyone who hadn't been in that clearing. The papers would be published, and the vaccine would be deployed, and Jean Vance would be prosecuted, and Jin Park's name would appear in acknowledgement sections and footnotes for decades. And somewhere above her, in the deep canopy where the light arrived, broken and green and ancient, something watched without watching, moved without moving, and carried its invisible passenger through a forest that had been here long before the word virus existed, and would be here long after the word no longer mattered. She set the branch back where she'd found it. She left it there for whoever had placed it. Some things in nature were never meant to be found. Some things find you anyway.